Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm very pleased to bring before the House the Environmental Planning and Assessment Amendment Short-Term Rental Accommodation Bill 2018, and I note the students in the House today and welcome them and hope you have a great day visiting Parliament, one of the oldest Parliament in the country. This bill delivers on the Greens' commitment to ensuring that local communities have a say in issues and legislation that affect them. And I note my colleague, the member for Balmain, is here in the House, and he is a strong advocate, as is my colleague Jenny Leung, the member for Newtown, standing up for communities, whether it's against, whether it is in the context of the compulsory acquisition of people's homes, or whether it is about retaining public land for public use. The Greens have a proud record in standing up for communities that are not commodities. As the member for Ballina, I'm dedicated to our local community and retaining the sense of connectivity amongst people in our towns and villages. The sense of community and connectivity with other communities in the Northern Rivers, and the sense of community and connectivity that is at the heart of the deep regional identity we have. I've stood proudly with our community time and time again to stand up for our way of life, to stand up for our share of the Sydney coffers, and to stave off inappropriate development, and to stand for development that serves our community, development that serves that end of connectivity and sustainable economic growth. Not unlike, Mr Speaker, my great-great-grandparents in the Northern Rivers, the cane farmers on the Hegarty side and the dairy farmers on the Hoffman side, who rallied with their community to get their sugar and dairy out of the region with the first North Coast rail line between Murwillumbah, Byron Bay and Lismore in 1894 and Grafton in 1905. Not unlike my great-grandparents, Dave and Annie Hegarty, active members of the South Lismore Progress Society, championing for the homeless and unemployed through the Great Depression. I know my forebears would agree with me that we are a community, not a commodity. We are a place of natural wonder that attracts 2.2 million tourists a year, and we benefit from the economic prosperity that this brings. But we are first and foremost a community of people living in a place of natural wonder who work, live and play, who raise our families and volunteer in our community and live in that place. I stand in this place today to say that we face a crisis in retaining that sense of community if the Liberal National Party does not allow local councils, like Byron Shire Council, to regulate holiday letting. We have a uniqueness in Byron Shire in particular that the LNP don't seem to grasp, and certainly the Nationals on the North Coast may grasp but don't care about. That uniqueness is the ratio of tourist visitors to residents, let alone the ratio of tourist visitors to ratepayers. The member for Barwon may love to have the problem of too many tourists visiting Broken Hill. The member for Lakemba may love to see Airbnb burgeoning in the communities in his electorate. But in my electorate, for residents in towns like Byron Bay and Brunswick Heads, unfettered holiday letting is destroying our sense of identity and community and handing our towns and villages over to property investors and the big end of town. This bill proposes that it's very simple, Mr Speaker. It's a simple bill. It proposes that councils be allowed to set the maximum number of days for short-term rental accommodation in their local government area without development consent, rather than the 180 to 365 days proposed by recent government legislation. Local councils are governed by democratically elected representatives of their community. Why don't you trust them to work with their own communities to establish what is right for that community? If holiday letting is welcome 365 days of the year, then let the council decide that. If they want to, as is happening right across the world, limit that because of the loss of community, then they should be allowed to do that. This legislation will give flexibility to those local government areas where short-term holiday accommodation is welcomed and encouraged by tourism, for tourism, and to those areas like Byron Bay where unfettered holiday letting is killing community. Other local government areas where this is a problem include the Blue Mountains, the Snowy River Shire Council, Bega Valley Shire Council, Cessnock City Council, and Shoalhaven and Gosford councils. And we know, Mr Speaker, that there was an inquiry back in 2014, and my colleague, the member for Balmain, was on that inquiry. And none of those recommendations appear, Mr Speaker, to have any relevance in this term of government. Long-term secure rental accommodation is at a crisis point in so many communities in New South Wales, and this has been exacerbated by unregulated short-term holiday letting. The more short-term holiday rental accommodation there is in a popular visitor destination, the fewer affordable, stable, long-term tenancies there are likely to be for residents. It's really not that surprising. Whilst most residents accept the impacts of living in a tourism town, including the pressures of crowding and increased traffic, it is unacceptable when their neighbourhoods are disrupted and they lose their amenity. There are some crucial points with this controversial issue. Tourism and business zones are where commercial activities have been deemed appropriate, but residential zones are defined to provide areas for community to flourish. And what we have with the share economy, with the stays economy, whatever you want to call it, what we have is a conflation of that, of the traditional residential as opposed to commercial zones in towns and villages. This involves the establishment, the residential zones are about the establishment of a permanent community by creating neighbourhoods where people know who lives next door and in their street. And for the city folk, this may not seem so relevant, but I can assure you, in my communities, people don't lock their doors necessarily. People do know their neighbours, and they take their bin in when they see that they're out late. They talk over the fence about local issues or the weather and make a point of keeping up with each other's lives, each other's children and what's going on. Permanent residents are the lifeblood of our community. They provide social and cultural capital. They are the parents on the P&C and coaching the soccer teams. They form our volunteer base in the Rural Fire Service, Marine Rescue, Meals on Wheels, Surf Life Saving, State Emergency Services, the school canteen, the list goes on. Volunteers also provide many community services supporting our aged, homeless, young and other vulnerable groups. It is residents who have protected and preserved what is precious in communities such as Byron Bay. So many good folk before me have cared enough about the world and the beauty of the North Coast that they've conserved and protected what we all now love about towns like Byron Bay. And it is what has made it the international icon that it is. How crazily ironic is it that now unfettered tourism and a two-stroke accommodation economy being foisted on our community by this government is destroying the amenity of locals and the very communities that have built the place. The actual reason people come to towns like Byron Bay is at stake here. Mr Speaker, the position often put by the sharing economy platforms and advocates is that it helps locals financially and provides a local perspective and experience for visitors. Well, I'm here to tell the House that this is not the case in the Shire of Byron Bay in particular. There are some properties that advertise a room or two for letting within a house in Byron Shire, and this does allow for the spirit of the share economy, the mum and dad doing something on the side. But the letting out of entire houses on a permanent basis delivers real issues for community. According to AirDNA, an online Airbnb data analysis company, 76% of the total 1,108 active rentals in the Byron Bay local government area, which is not a lot by the way, are being let out as entire houses on Airbnb. So 76% of the rental stock is being let out as entire houses on Airbnb. Only 24% are private rooms in houses. This is against the purpose of residential zoning, which is defined to protect residential amenity and encourage a sense of community and neighbourhood. Currently, 51% of houses on the sharing platform are available to rent full-time. That is, they're available to rent on Airbnb more than 6 months of the year. This means these properties are not available for permanent residents, either for home ownership or rental, and that equates to approximately 5,000 people who are not able to access housing in Byron Shire. So you can see the perfect storm that we find ourselves in. Mr Speaker, the use of entire houses is like mini motels in residential areas. They are tourism establishments previously prohibited under planning laws and are a commercial use of a residential dwelling. One Airbnb host in Byron Bay has earned an impressive $3.7 million from 40 properties in Byron Bay, placing them as one of the top Airbnb earners in the country. And it's also, Mr Speaker, about shifting costs and real costs. Byron Shire Council collects funds to offset the costs of providing services for community and businesses. Residential rates are lower than commercial rates, as residents are recognised as a great source of value beyond just revenue, whereas tourists are a source of value to a business, but are actually a cost to council and communities in terms of wear and tear on public facilities, roads, parks, waste, and all of these are council's responsibility and ratepayers' costs. No wonder Airbnb try hard to defend their right to operate. It's a lucrative multinational business with no costs or return of fees to local councils. In contrast to this, bed and breakfasts, who also provide rooms to visitors, are required to submit a development application, and neighbours have the right to make submissions about that development. They actually have their say. Compliant accommodation providers also pay significant development contribution fees, and they pay increased council rates for the operation of the commercial use. And these offset the inconvenience to communities through money for infrastructure and wear and tear on amenities. What do communities like ours get to offset the impact of 2.2 million visitors each year who contribute neither to the social capital nor the cost of maintaining our towns, particularly when there is no commercial rates, when there are no developer contributions? And that's what we are facing with unfettered holiday letting. And then there is the true cost of living next to a holiday let. Mr Speaker, a dear friend of mine who did for many, many years, sold her property in Sydney and made the sea change and bought her dream home in Byron Bay. A humble home, not a multi-million-dollar mansion or anything like that, but certainly was able to afford to buy a home near Byron Bay. She's a local volunteer, she's a swimmer in a swimming club, and she's an upstanding member of the community. But she's living next door to a multi-million-dollar holiday letting establishment that has different people frequenting it, sometimes every day, but certainly each weekend it's a new mob next door. And it would be no exaggeration to say that it has ruined her life. And for 2 years, she basically for 2 years has done nothing except try and find someone to care, someone who is responsible, someone to listen about her situation. And she's facing the prospect of just selling and getting out. And that story, Mr Speaker, since I was elected, I've heard that story over and over and over again, which is why my council, our council, Byron Shire Council, applied to this government, asked this government, could they have 90 days? Could they please set those limits? And Mr Speaker, in the inquiry in this very House, those were the recommendations: creating precincts, allowing councils to have minimum days for holiday let before compliance was required, because the costs are so large. And Mr Speaker, it's not as though there are no big profiteers in all of this, and the profiteers are not like my friend Donna. 75% of the home share economy in Byron Shire, as I've said, are whole houses. With the cost of buying houses in Byron Bay comparable to the eastern suburbs of Sydney, that is not mum and dad investors. That's high-end property investors who may never even visit the area except once a year as a tax rort, or they may never spend a penny in any local business, in any cafe or restaurant. And in terms of social and financial capital, a permanent resident in that same property value adds exponentially to the broader community and financially over time. And then, Mr Speaker, comes the issue of unaffordable housing. Housing stress is a real thing for my city colleagues. Housing stress in Byron Shire is outrageous. It's almost exactly the same statistically as Balmain. The impact of the Liberal National Party's open slather approach to holiday letting reduces the availability of housing stock for sale or rent. It really isn't rocket science. It increases the lack of housing availability. Short-term letting is a commercial activity without any of the real costs of operating a business. It's an attractive investment, with some owners also taking advantage of negative gearing and capital gains tax. And Mr Speaker, we know it's been in the media lately that the Australian Taxation Office is looking at this very, very carefully. Negative gearing and capital gains tax, which were introduced to incentivise property investment to increase rental stock, not tourism, are now being manipulated and abused for short-term profit by a few. The outcome and impacts are far from the intent of those introductions. And as I said, Mr Speaker, the Australian Taxation Office is reviewing and auditing the so-called share economy to assess whether those who use tax incentives are compliant with Australian tax laws. The reality is that the permanent use of entire residential dwellings for Airbnb and other such platforms comes at a great cost to residents and to councils. This law, is needed to ensure that councils that are negatively impacted by the overuse of short-term rental accommodation can put in place limits on the number of days a residential property is allowed to be let on sharing platforms. And what is the consequence? If the government today supported my bill, or next week, if the opposition supported this bill, the sky will not fall. It is simply a handful of councils that are facing this perfect storm. Mr Speaker, this bill could help to ensure the return of vibrant local community and neighbourhoods in affected areas. My community cannot afford to be a test case for the next 12 months. Real community consultations conducted before introducing changes or allowing unfettered disruption. The idea that you completely unregulate, completely open slather and review it in 12 months, well, a lot can happen in 12 months, and we do have an election in just 6 months. Mr Speaker, in 2014, the General Purpose Standing Committee No. 3 published its report, Tourism in Local Communities, which acknowledged the role that short-term holiday letting plays in communities for good and for ill. Its response to concerns by areas affected by the issue was summarised thus. The committee acknowledges that many communities rely on the practice of short-term holiday letting to meet accommodation demands, provide a source of income for owners, and provide economic support to towns. Indeed, in many areas, holiday rental is a vital part of the local economy, and any restriction on holiday rental would seriously impact local businesses. However, the committee is cognisant of the fact, and I read on, is cognisant of the fact that holiday letting in some areas has led to issues and disturbances caused by antisocial behaviour, resulting in significant distress for many residents. So this is back in 2014. We also note that the concerns raised by some inquiry participants regarding the impact on communities from a lack of permanent residents and the unfair competition concerns raised by businesses. Mr Speaker, this is from the General Purpose Standing Committee's own report. I read on. Various suggestions have been made which aim to address these issues, such as establishing holiday letting precincts, requiring development approval, development of a statewide government policy, or industry self-regulation. It's a shame that our local councils are unable to explore the very recommendations of this place. The LNP's approach to holiday letting in 2018 has made a mockery of the 2014 inquiry. And we see, Mr Speaker, the overseas experience. Limiting the number of days a property is able to be rented out on Airbnb or any other sharing platform is not a new concept, but we are always behind the times. It has been in place in various countries and cities overseas, and it has worked to reduce the numbers of residences available on sharing platforms in housing stress areas. In New York State, it is against the law to rent out an entire apartment for less than a month at a time, and under new city laws, Airbnb will be required to hand over the names, addresses and other information about hosts to a special enforcement office that will monitor adherence to state laws.
Order. The member for Ballina. I hate to interrupt, but I'll have to fix the resumption of this debate as an order of the day for a future day.